Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined this evening by two excellent guests. Firstly by Emma Harper, MSP, an MSP for South Scotland. Emma, how are you doing this evening?
I'm very well. It's been a long day, but some of it has been quite exhilarating.
Well, that sounds good. On the other side of me, we have former SNP MP and Director of Momentous Change, Roger Mullin. Roger, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I don't know if I've had quite as exciting a day as Emma, though.
Well, we may talk about that later, but we start this evening, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. And as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 1,460,131 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres. Of these, 1,306,708 were confirmed negative, 153,423 were positive. There were 1,875 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland today, and sadly, there were 54 new reported deaths. This will, of course, be an underestimate of the total number of cases, as not everyone with the virus will show symptoms, and not everyone will necessarily get tested. As always, we urge you, if you are showing symptoms of a new, dry, persistent cough, a fever, or a change in your sense of taste or smell, please do book a test as soon as you can. Of the people who have tested positive, there were 1,717 people in hospital last night, 133 of whom were in intensive care. And the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 5,023. This number only includes those who have died in hospital having received a positive test for the virus. The latest UK daily figures published today show that 83,203 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 1,243 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just those in hospitals. And we also have the final report from the Office for National Statistics for 2020, covering deaths in England and Wales in week 53 of the year, which was the week ending the 1st of January 2021. 53-week years do occur occasionally, depending on what day Hogmanay falls on. In that week, 3,144 deaths were recorded where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate. Of these, 2,834 were in England, up from 2,634 the previous week. 310 were in Wales, an increase from 278 in the previous week. However, all these figures should be taken with a degree of caution, as both weeks featured public holidays when register offices were closed. This report takes the total number of COVID-related deaths across England for the whole of 2020 to 76,610. Total excess mortality for the year was 71,731, or around 14% higher than the 5-year average. In Wales, the total was 4,963. Excess mortality in Wales was 3,945, just under 12% above average. This report means that the total number of COVID-related deaths recorded across the UK at the 1st of January stood at 89,243. We will have the NRS report for Scotland up to January the 10th for you on tomorrow night's show. And before we go on with the rest of today's headlines, if you would like to join the conversation here, please do so. Follow us on Twitter at BroadcastScot and then use the hashtag Scotland@7. We will, as you can see, be flashing some of those tweets up on the screen throughout the show. So do please get in touch with us. We would love to hear from you. But we start this evening in England, and Marcus Rashford has warned that something is going wrong with free school meal delivery in England during lockdown, after he held talks with the school catering company at the centre of a row over inadequate free school meals parcels. The Manchester United footballer earlier condemned some of the free school meal packages being sent to children and families learning from home as unacceptable after parents posted photos on Twitter. It later emerged, however, that Chartwells, which was identified on social media as the supplier of one meagre food parcel, is a member of the footballer's Child Food Poverty Task Force. Chartwells was also summoned to talks with the Department for Education after photos of food parcels went viral on social media. Food parcels have been sent to children who would normally qualify for free school meals and are now learning remotely during the national lockdown. One tweet showed a package supposedly containing £30 worth of food to last for 10 days, comprising just a loaf of bread, some cheese, a tin of beans, 2 carrots, 2 bananas, 3 apples, 2 potatoes, a bag of pasta, 3 frubes, 2 serene bars, and a tomato. Following his discussions with Chartwells, the England International raised concerns about the amount of food being made available to the most vulnerable children and called for independent businesses to mobilise to help distribute parcels. So Emma, let me come to you first. And I think probably first of all, it is worth stressing, this is what's happening in England. Could you just tell us a wee bit about the differences in what's happening here in Scotland?
Well, obviously the pictures that we've seen that Marcus has posted, and the £5.76 worth of costed food is supposed to last for 10 days, and you've just listed what was in that picture. It's actually pretty shocking, because it means that, if the government are spending £30 and then there's only £5.76 of food, it's like, well, where's the rest of that money going? So, we obviously have issues with rising food banks and challenges for help and support, but the Scottish government have taken the move to be more positive and support feeding children who would normally qualify for school meals. So I think it's not nice to see what's happening in England, south of the border, but I am pleased that the Scottish Government has taken the decisions it has to support our young folk north of the border.
Mm. And as you say, a number of people quite quickly looked at this package and said, well, this isn't £30 worth of food. It's not even close to it. What do you think is the reasoning behind this, behind getting a private company to do this, rather than just, for example, adding £30 a week to child benefit for everybody who needs it?
Oh, it's hard to kind of figure out what's in the minds of the people that are making the decisions in Westminster. That it would have been so much easier just to give people either vouchers or do it in a way where they just get the money in their bank so they can make the decisions and have that 30 quid themselves. But is it back to this, cronyism? It's jobs for your pals, it's money for your pals. I have not had a chance to look into that in detail, but I just think that the decisions that are being made by the Westminster government look like it benefits the Tory party donors.
Mm. Well, let me turn to you, Roger. And this is one of those questions that we've come to a number of times over the last year or so, is why does it take a Man United footballer to be the person who notices these problems and gets them into the headlines?
Yes, well, I mean, one thing I would say is you've got to ask what so-called investigative journalists have been doing if it takes a footballer to find out what's going on and to reveal it. The UK government seems to be getting away with a tremendous amount of what many people, I think, would construe to be some form of abuse of the awarding of public contracts. You've just got to wonder what due diligence they did. Did they set a requirement of the amount of money that must be spent on food? It would appear not. And I agree very much with Emma. From a finance point of view, it would have been easier and fairer to send out simply a voucher to everybody who's due. And that would mean people would get the full value. And it would also have the added benefit that they would be able to choose food that is appropriate for themselves. So none of this seems to make any real sense to me.
Mm. Yeah, well, we will move on just now, but obviously we'll keep an eye on what developments happen. But we come back to Scotland now, and from 4 a.m. on Friday, the 15th of January, passengers travelling to Scotland from outside the common travel area must have a valid negative COVID-19 test result, taken no more than 3 days before the scheduled time of departure. This will be checked by operators, and passengers with a positive test result or an invalid certificate will be refused boarding. This addition of pre-departure testing does not replace the requirement for all passengers arriving from countries not on the quarantine exemption list to self-isolate for 10 days, even with a negative test. Border Force will undertake spot checks of passengers arriving in Scotland as an additional measure to ensure compliance with pre-departure testing, and will be able to apply a fixed penalty notice of £480 if they identify travellers without a valid certificate. Non-essential travel to or from Scotland is currently illegal, and that will not immediately change with the introduction of pre-departure testing. So Roger, I think the first obvious question here is, why has it taken us so long to have any kind of controls going on at our airports?
Well, I think, of course, as you will know only too well, part of the problem is that the powers to control things like international travel are reserved to Westminster. So it's not within the powers of the Scottish Government to act as strongly as some of us would hope. I do think this is a major issue. My own view is that part of the problem for the UK as a whole, and obviously Scotland is caught up on this, is that we've not had the type of controls of international travel that other countries have had. And so we've been very prone to importing the virus. And I think that has quite clearly happened in quite a number of cases. So, yeah, it is a problem. It's good to see something being done, but I would be very cautious in interpreting too much into the power of this move.
Mm. And Emma, I've asked this question of several guests on the show, but the whole point of Brexit supposedly was to be able to control our borders, and yet during the height of the pandemic last year, the UK was the only country in Europe that didn't close its borders. What do you think is going on? Why has it taken so long for the UK government to wake up to this issue?
I think it's pretty shocking that it's taken this long for the UK government to actually do some action. Michael Matheson gave us evidence at Health and Sport Committee this morning about this introduction of the new measures that are going to come forward as far as pre-testing to make sure that you've got a negative test before you come into Scotland. If we had the ability to control our borders the way Jacinda Ardern has in New Zealand, we probably would have been looking at a whole set of different numbers right now. And so, and again, you know, partly this is just another basic argument for Scotland to be able to control our own borders ourselves, so we can take decisions that work for Scotland. And it is real challenging. I live near the border between Scotland and England, and we've had many cross-border issues throughout this pandemic, and we've even had opposition members resign the whip from their party and step down from their positions that because they took opposition views on managing cross-border travel from Scotland to England. But I think that the UK government again set out on a path where they would rather support the economy than saving people's lives.
Well, we move on now to another issue of saving lives. The First Minister and the Minister for Drugs Policy, Angela Constance, have attended a meeting of the Drugs Death Task Force to discuss the group's priorities to improve outcomes for people whose lives are affected by drugs. Last year saw 1,264 deaths which had a drug-related element, a higher rate than across all EU countries and more than 3 times the UK as a whole. 404 of these were in the Greater Glasgow and Clyde area. Ms Constance said, meeting the task force for the first time was a key opportunity for me to recognise the hard work that has already been done and to hear ideas of how we can build on the plans we have. We are determined to lead a national mission to deliver a step change in the action taken to reduce harm and promote recovery to save lives. I want to continue building on the momentum to ensure we take the actions necessary to reduce Scotland's drug deaths and better support those living with addictions. This includes prioritising those areas of emergency response which the task force has already identified as being effective in reducing drug deaths, such as the distribution of naloxone and the introduction of vital support to people following a non-fatal overdose. However, reducing drug deaths and getting more people into treatment also requires us to address the stigma related to substance use and addictions. Today, we heard from some of those with lived experience about the development of a national stigma charter, something which the Scottish Government is hugely supportive of. Now, Emma, Angela Constance has kind of been thrust into this role. You obviously know her well, you've worked with her for a long time. Is Angela Constance the right person to lead this, do you think?
Um, uh, yes, I think Joe Fitzpatrick needs to be recognised that he actually did a lot of work in taking action forward with the drugs task force. Angela's experience is also in her role before she came into Parliament, already knew a lot of the issues that we're facing in Scotland, and she's already agreed to meet with me to talk about specific challenges in my area, which is very rural. So we have some different challenges in my area, but I support the work that Joe Fitzpatrick took forward as introducing not only naloxone more, but nasal naloxone that can be delivered by our police service. So there has been some action already that's been taken forward. So I'm sure it'll be great to hear Angela Constance's response on Thursday, because we're having a members' debate about it.
And Roger, we've seen the Scottish Government, for example, calling for changes to drug laws in order to enable, for example, safe injection sites. But that's been just flatly refused by the Westminster Government. Do you see any way that the Scottish Government can move some of these kinds of things forward without support from Westminster?
It's very difficult because of the reserved nature of some of these laws. It's just another example of what Emma said in reply to the previous question, that if Scotland had full powers, we wouldn't have been in this situation, because our policy response could have been stronger and it would certainly have been different. Nobody's got a magic wand. It's very difficult. But without the full powers, you're hamstrung even more than you are with such a difficult problem. So I certainly think that the full powers being brought to a Scottish Parliament would help considerably.
Well, we move
Kenny,
on. Sorry, Emma.
can I
Yes,
add one more thing?
sure.
So I was part of the Scottish Affairs inquiry into drugs deaths in Scotland. That's Pete Wishart's committee. And, I wonder why the Westminster government are just digging their heels in, because we've seen evidence across other countries. Portugal, for instance, Geneva, safe injection rooms in Sweden, in Canada, in Vancouver. So I just feel as if, as Roger says, we're being hamstrung. If we could take these decisions ourselves, we would have a much different approach, and we would certainly be addressing the stigma in a probably an easier way as well.
Well, we do move on just now, and the SNP has renewed calls for the UK government to compensate businesses in Scotland suffering the effects of the Tory Brexit sellout, after industry leaders warned that post-Brexit delays are costing Scottish seafood exporters over £1 million per day. James Withers, the head of Scotland Food and Drink, told the Politics Home website that Scottish seafood exporters to the EU could be losing upwards of £1 million in sales a day as a result of Brexit disruption and delays. David Leeper, the managing director of Peterhead company Seafood Ecos, said the situation facing exporters was a disgrace and questioned why should private companies take the pain for government incompetence. Alistair Roberts, who owns 3 fishing boats in Greenock, told LBC yesterday that Brexit has ended up a lot worse than expected and warned that buyers in France, Spain, Italy will go elsewhere for their seafood as a result of Brexit delays. It has also been reported that some fish prices fell by as much as 80% at Peterhead Market yesterday due to new paperwork demands and export blockages. So, Roger, let me come to you on this. This is a huge problem for seafood exporters because obviously delays affect the quality of the produce very, very quickly. Seafood that's less than fresh pretty much has no value. How do you think the UK government could address this and perhaps make it a little bit easier for exporters to get their goods to market quickly?
Well, they could have solved the problem not by pursuing Brexit. That would have been the easiest thing to do. They are now left with a severe problem because of the way in which they've negotiated a deal, which really has failed to take account of precisely what you were saying, Kenny, and that is the way in which some goods that are exported are not time sensitive, but some goods, such as seafood, are hugely time sensitive. And it strikes me that there's been nothing arranged to take account of that. No additional support, no reduction in the paperwork, no real support. So, I mean, I'm just at a loss to think on what they're able to do quickly now to resolve these matters, given the mess they made of negotiations. And I would say this problem is affecting far more than just the fishing industry that you state, bad though that is, of course. I was recently in discussions about other business matters, people who supply services, which is big in Scotland, and where if you send goods into the EU under the current arrangement, they can circulate within the EU. But if you want to export your services to an individual EU country, you need to have separate agreements with each individual country. So the amount of paperwork mushrooms hugely. And this is putting off lots of types of businesses. And so it's a real challenge. And it's only in the early days of this challenge. Things are going to get a lot more severe, in my view, as time rolls on.
Mm. Yeah, Emma,
Yep.
obviously we've talked about fishing on the show many times, and COVID has already put a great deal of pressure on a lot of exporters. Your area obviously has a lot of agriculture and fishing. What are you hearing from constituents about this kind of problem?
Just it's huge problem. Just on the back of what James Withers tweeted about today. I attended a webinar last Friday where the questions of forms and processing and batch numbers and issues, and there's so much detail. And Food Standards Scotland have had to increase the number of supporting personnel so that they can help our processors because of the issue with fish, but also red meat and other products as well. And we have one of our biggest scallop businesses is in Dumfries and Galloway, and the scallops come into Kirkcudbright Harper. And so the whole ongoing supply chain, in order to keep everything best and optimized for shipping, it's going to be a real challenge. We had a 7-day reprieve because of the January 1st issue of transition. And what we're going to see now is just further issues. And I'm really concerned that we're going to have delays all through the whole supply chain. And we've seen the lines of lorries at Dover. And again, Roger's absolutely right. We didn't need to have this. We didn't want Brexit. Scotland didn't vote for Brexit. And this could have all been avoided if there had been some sense in power in Westminster.
Mm. We did, of course, have a long discussion with Deirdre Brock on Friday night's show about fishing and agriculture and the impact from Brexit. If you're interested, it's well worth catching up on. Well, we move on now to more business stories, and the SNP has said that the Tory government isn't doing enough to support businesses, as new figures reveal retailers suffered their worst annual sales performance on record in 2020. New research from the British Retail Consortium suggests overall sales fell by 0.3% in 2020, the worst annual change since 1995. Non-food sales fell by about 5%, with physical non-food stores suffering a drop in sales of 1/4 compared with 2019. Drew Hendry MP said the Chancellor must deliver more support, including handing over the missing £375 million promised to Scottish firms, extending the furlough scheme through 2021, devolving financial powers, and delivering a meaningful fiscal stimulus of at least £98 billion. It follows warnings by the Federation of Small Businesses that 250,000 small businesses could be forced to close this year due to a lack of government support. Last week, a report from the Centre for Retail Research said 2020 was the worst for high street job losses in over 25 years, with nearly 180,000 retail job losses, up almost a quarter on 2019. And Roger, I mean, we've already been talking about this death of the high street for several years with the growth of online retail, but the pandemic has really been a hammer blow to a lot of businesses, hasn't it?
It's been absolutely dreadful. And I remember some months ago being in this program and having a discussion with you, Kenny, when we pointed out that this crisis of the pandemic is creating a different type of economic a problem to ones in the past, different type of economic recession. Rather than it being caused by a fall in demand, this is caused by government policies that are leading to the closure of businesses. And because of that, the government has a responsibility, in my view, as both a moral responsibility as well as an economic responsibility to make sure these businesses have a future, because it's government action that is closing them down. So I agree very much with the calls of Drew Henry. I'm particularly pleased that Drew has called for further devolution of the economic powers to act. One of the other areas that's a real problem is some small businesses. They might be registered as businesses, but effectively they run by just one person, an individual, who are effectively self-employed. And many of these businesses are getting no support whatsoever. So there really is a real problem coming down the line. If people imagine that when hopefully we get rid of this COVID-19 and the pandemic and things open up again, if they imagine everything is going to open up again, it's not. We're going to be left with great problems that we're going to have to tackle in terms of business development, redevelopment, and the like.
Mm. And Emma, you know, we're not just talking about businesses closing down. These obviously provide hundreds, thousands of jobs. It's going to be really difficult to recover from this crisis because businesses that close down aren't just going to bounce back as soon as people can get out and shop normally, are they?
Yep, that's right. It's obviously it's a concern across the whole of Scotland, and many local authorities have got recovery plans that they're in place. For me, it is a huge concern that Scotland can't borrow money in order to help support wages or schemes or other funds. That's the UK government again. So I agree that further financial devolution, full fiscal autonomy would be great for
Hmm.
Scotland. And again, it's then what we would then do to support businesses ourselves. We obviously need to be really keen to continue to press the treasurer to make sure that we have whatever measures that we need that Rishi Sunak puts in place.
Yeah, and Emma, just quickly, that £375 million that the Treasury initially announced for Scotland, and then very quickly that money disappeared again. It wasn't being delivered at all. I know you're not a Scottish Government minister, but clearly you work closely with your colleagues in government. What are they saying about this? Are they getting any sort of positive noises from the Treasury about a resolution to that issue?
Well, in looking at information in the last couple of days, there doesn't seem to be any movement on that. It is interesting that the Tories will lambast this wonderful policy that the Rishi Sunak puts out, but then when we find out that actually that isn't the case, then everybody's pretty silent. So I'm sure that Kate Forbes will be making statements or looking at further asks of the Treasury in Westminster pretty soon.
Yeah, well, we will keep an eye on that story, of course. But we go to a story now from Emma's area. And a former ferry port could become a border control post under a post-Brexit bid launched by local leaders. Authorities in Dumfries and Galloway say the old Stena port in Stranraer must become a key transit site now that the UK has left the EU. Border control posts are used to carry out checks on consignments of animals and animal products. Prior to Brexit, this was needed for goods arriving at a European Union border from a third country, but EU withdrawal means more red tape for Scottish firms. In December, Scottish Rural Economy Secretary Fergus Ewing suggested such a post should be established at nearby Cairnryan, which has live ferry connections to Northern Ireland. But ex-Labour MSP Elaine Murray, the leader of Dumfries and Galloway Council, has now written to Europe Secretary Michael Russell to request a post is placed in Stranraer instead. Murray and Deputy Leader Rob Davidson say such a move would bring valuable employment opportunities to the region and lay the ground for broader economic potential. So Emma, obviously Michael Russell is not the man to talk to about this. This is a UK matter, but given the amount of trade between Scotland and Northern Ireland, which is effectively an EU country at this stage, it does make sense to have something, some sort of beefed up border control post in that area, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I am aware of the letter that Councillor Elaine Murray, as our council leader in Dumfries and Galloway, and Deputy Rob Davidson have written to Michael Russell. But I've, on the back of that, I've written to the Secretary of State, Alistair Jack, who happens to be the MP for Dumfries and Galloway. And I am keen to hear about what his ideas are, because if there needs to be a silver lining, or if there is to be a silver lining from Brexit, we need people in Stranraer to have jobs out of it. And Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewing is right to suggest that we have a border post near Cairnryan, but the old ferry port in Stranraer, it's 6 miles away. So whatever infrastructure is required or is needed, I would just ask Alistair Jack to get a move on and tell us what's going on, because it seems like they've been really reluctant to communicate right through this whole process. I've asked numerous questions in Chamber, I've raised it at committee, and as a Rural Committee member, and I think it's really important that we actually get some information which is crucial for the constituents that I represent in Dumfries and Galloway, and especially in the west of the region in Stranraer.
And I mean, a huge amount of trade does cross from Scotland to both parts of Ireland via the port at Cairnryan. How much is it affecting people now that there isn't the right infrastructure in place, but all this new paperwork and red tape has to be got through?
There's been some delays in the last week, for instance, in the first week of the new year, and I know there was a 7-day reprieve on moving produce. Northern Ireland depends on that ferry link to get produce from the Central Belt down the A77, across on the ferry, and then to Northern Ireland. So the route's very, very critical. I've done some work around the sea crossing, and the sea crossing between Cairnryan and Larne and Belfast isn't affected by weather the way that other sea crossings are, and it's a very short one as well. So it's a really important route, and I'm sure that the Secretary of State is aware of that because it's on his doorstep, and I would support whatever measures we can take to make sure that the people in Stranraer are communicated with, and so that they know what's going on. And again, if the Dumfries and Galloway Council is going to be a border council, they're obviously going to need further financial support. And the no detriment argument could be assigned based on any measures that will impede or impact Dumfries and Galloway Council, especially financially.
Well, we will obviously keep an eye on that story as it develops. But we move on just now, and there is renewed pressure on the UK government to urgently support households with energy costs after new research revealed 1 in 10 people have missed an energy bill because they ran out of money since COVID restrictions began. The call for action follows a YouGov poll for Citizens Advice Scotland that showed 15% of people have run out of money before payday since COVID restrictions began, have missed an emergency payment. Citizens Advice Scotland has launched its Big Energy Saving Month 2021 campaign, encouraging people to save energy and get the financial support they're entitled to by seeking advice. The campaign launches as temperatures plummet across Scotland and energy costs increase as more people stay home to comply with coronavirus restrictions. Since the pandemic began, consumer groups and the SNP have repeatedly warned that an increase in energy bills due to the coronavirus lockdown could leave more Scots at risk of fuel poverty. The SNP has called for the UK government to assist households with meeting energy costs through a package of financial measures for the self-employed, increasing UK statutory sick pay to the EU national average, increasing child benefit, and making the universal credit uplift permanent, as well as extending it to legacy benefits. So, Roger, this was obvious. I mean, surely it was clear that if people were having to spend more time at home, if people were having to be online all day for work, if kids were going to have to be online for school, the energy costs were going to go up. What do you think has gone wrong in the system where this hasn't been something that's been given priority?
Well, in a sense, it's not unlike what Emma talked about in her response to the last question, and that is the UK government are laggards here. They are simply not planning in advance and taking the decisions that they need to take and take the actions that they need to take. You're absolutely right. Everybody knew that if you were going into any form of lockdown over a winter period, that it's bound to lead to an increase in domestic energy costs, and that needs to be attended to. And this is not something that we are only aware of here in Scotland. It might interest you to know that 3 days ago, I was interviewed by the Finnish Institute for Energy, I think it's called, academics there doing research into what different countries are doing by way of response to energy policy. And they were interested in Scotland. And so it just shows you that this is an issue that others have been looking at in detail, researching in detail, action being taken in or being proposed in other countries. It's really time that the UK government came up to the plate, but I'm not terribly optimistic.
Mm. And Emma, the Scottish government has done a lot of work over the entire history of the SNP in power to try and deal with fuel poverty, but it has no power over fuel prices, and it has no power or very little power over the average person's income. Do you see anything that the Scottish government could do, or is this something that's really going to have to come from the UK government?
Within the powers that we have, I know that Kevin Stewart and other ministers like Paul Wheelhouse are always looking at ways that we can support energy being delivered more efficiently, for instance. But the bottom line is that it doesn't seem to be a priority for the UK government to support people in Scotland. It's a rural area. There's distances between where people live and where they work, or where people live and where they go to hospital appointments, for instance. So it's a real challenges. And again, our climate is probably a wee bit chillier in Scotland, and especially at this time of year, it is a real challenge. So, for me, I would be again saying that it's not a UK government priority to care about helping people with their energy bills, and I would be asking the Scottish government to just keep pressing with our wish for Scotland to take control of our own energy as well.
Mm. Well, we move across to Ireland now, and an Irish inquiry into homes for unmarried mothers run by the Catholic Church from 1922 to 1998 found an appalling level of infant mortality, with some 9,000 children dying in the so-called mother and baby homes. That represents about 15% of all who entered the institutions, with no single explanation for such a high rate of mortality, the government-commissioned report published today said. It also found that there were no statutory regulations in place for the foreign adoptions of 1,638 children, mostly to the United States. Allegations that large sums of money were given to agencies in Ireland that arranged foreign adoptions are impossible to prove and impossible to disprove, it added. Emma, this is, there have been a series of horrible stories come out about these homes. What do you think can be done to kind of mend the damage that's been done?
This is something that has not been on my radar but obviously it's a really it's shocking to hear over this period of time. Adoption processes were appropriate, and it's not something that I have experience with. So, Kenny, that's I suppose my answer so far is that it really is a shame to hear about these numbers, and obviously it's something that I would probably need to pick up further and see what could be done better, and certainly so that we don't have this in Scotland.
Yeah. Roger, it is very difficult, isn't it, when we're looking at things that go back as far as 1922, to kind of address any kind of justice for that. Have you got any thoughts on how Ireland can move forward on this kind of problem?
Yes, well, I was listening to a number of people who were the victims, obviously more recently than 1922, but the 1950s and 60s and the like. And there's a lot of anger about the report, it seems to me. And part of it is, first of all, a lack of completely honest revelation about the nature of the abuse that took place. And secondly, that there's little avenue for justice for those who are still living to seek any reparation. Now, I know that there are proposals for the government to make available funds and the like and look at support in that kind of way, which seems to be being welcomed. But I think there is a longing for justice among some of those who have lived through terrible circumstances, are now adults, but still carry the scars of dreadful treatment.
Yeah, it's a very, very sad story. But we move on now to the United States. And US law enforcement agencies securing Joe Biden's January 20th presidential inauguration ceremony have dramatically scaled up their budgets following the Capitol riot last week, according to a person involved with the planning. The Secret Service-led effort to fortify the event will create a more solemn production on the steps of the Capitol building than was the scene of a violent assault by supporters of outgoing President Donald Trump. Far fewer people than usual will attend the ceremony, which already had been scaled back due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and now also will have a bulked-up security detail. Biden's allies have been on edge about the security protocols after Trump supporters challenging the congressional certification of Biden's election victory stormed the building last Wednesday. The riot sent lawmakers into hiding and left 5 people dead, including a Capitol police officer. Dozens of people have been charged in the violence, and hundreds more cases are expected. Today, the House of Representatives is debating a motion to ask Vice President Mike Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment, by which he and the Cabinet can remove the President from office. If that motion is defeated and/or Pence refuses to follow it, impeachment proceedings are expected to follow quickly. Several members of Congress, including Ilhan Omar, have also called for legislators, including Senator Josh Hawley, to be prosecuted and removed from office for their part in inciting and supporting insurrection. So, Roger, I know you have a wee bit of an interest in American politics. I mean, what we saw last Wednesday was extraordinary. Do you think there is a case for prosecuting the legislators who kind of helped whip this mob up?
Yes, obviously there are different channels, different legislative rights in the US to hear, but I certainly would expect real action to be taken. I mean, some of the people like Ted Cruz and the like, who have been vociferous in their support of Trump and the lies about the election fraud and the like, I think it is highly likely they are going to be held to account in some manner. Just as I think from all the news that I've been hearing today from the States, it looks very much like Trump not only faces the problem of impeachment, because the great expectation is that Pence won't invoke Article 25, but that once he leaves office, he may well be open to very severe financial hardship. I noticed that, for example, his favoured bank in supplying loans, Deutsche Bank, has said it will no longer do any business with them at all, extend any other loans to them, and that Donald Trump is personally liable for a debt of $300 million. to them. And so, and he will be, once he becomes a private citizen, open to much more possible criminal action himself. So I think we're going to see it run for quite a long time. It's very difficult to forecast what the outcome is going to be. But I certainly think this has the potential to become a sea change in the relationship between the Republican Party and the broader electorate in the States.
Yeah, well, I was wondering what you think about that, because there are a fairly sizable number of Republican voters who are quite happy with what happened on Wednesday. They're not, they're not saying this was an outrage, but clearly there is a section of America that thinks this was a step way too far. Do you think this will have a long-term impact on Republican success in across the country?
Yes, I think putting it at its simplest, uh, if the Trump faction continues to be in power, I think some of the Republican Party will walk away from the Republican Party. And where they will go at the moment is rather uncertain. Some of them might even flip over to the Democrats. Some of them could sit for a time as independents. But I think there's the potential, if it's not seen to change tack, that it will lose some of its traditional forms of support in the country, particularly from the better educated sectors of the community. Uh, so there is a real dilemma in that sense. Also, if the Trump faction remains in control, then I would have thought and would have predicted that they're heading into the wilderness, because it's difficult to see how they're going to be able to recover in a democratic process when they are so fiercely fighting against a democratic process, if you follow my
Mm.
reasoning here. So I think there is the potential for a lot of change, but there's also, of course, as happens in these occasions, a lot of uncertainty. I think what's going to be particularly important over the next week or so is whether the FBI's document that indicated there's the possibility of direct action in 50 states by the Trump supporters. If that in any way comes to fruition, I think that will be a further major issue that America has to deal with. I do think in the longer run, they might find that they have to change some of their constitution to make it work more effectively, such as an impeachment and the like, but that's much further down the road. But this is definitely a big period of potential huge change in the body politic in the US.
Mm. And Emma, I don't know if you have quite Roger's interest in American politics, but it's clear to see that there is something deeply wrong in American politics when we have seen the president and many of his allies, including a number of legislators in state legislatures who were part of that mob. What do you think, just as an outsider looking in, what do you think it tells us about how we conduct maybe our own politics?
Um, I am actually interested in American politics. I lived in California for 14
Oh, I'm
years,
sorry.
and my husband grew up in Wyoming and worked in many of the states, in southern states as well. So no, it's didn't apologise, Kenny. It's very interesting. I lived in California when Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor. He was an actor, and so the binary politics of America. It's either Democrats or Republicans. It's just really interesting. It would be great to open up a wider discussion and maybe a more democratic approach, because everything's it's all very either or. But when we look at the voting patterns of women or black people or Latinos, and when I lived in California, there was it was a big area of democratic engagement, and so I think that we need to watch what's happening in America and hopefully see how it evolves in the future, and hopefully they'll evolve to have a more democratic, I guess, promotion, and maybe this will see a sea change to get more folk voting. We saw the postal ballots help Joe Biden, and we need to make sure we pay attention to what's happening with the United States as Joe Biden, gets inaugurated in 8 days' time.
Yeah. And when you look at the inauguration, I mean, there have been, as Roger said, there has been serious threats made. We've seen it. I mean, I've come across several just incredible claims made on social media. What do you think the process has to be to try and, I guess, de-radicalize this group of American voters?
Wow. It's difficult because we've had the similar groups of American voters promote guns, and I worked in the operating room where I took bullets out of people's hearts and livers and abdomens for a living, and so those same folk that are pro-gun, anti-mask, let's not socially distance, it's very polarized, and so engagement, obviously it takes a long time to engage and educate and support people to move forward. It's a really interesting binary society, and God, you would have a whole program talking about it if that was on your agenda.
Well, we might do that sometime very soon. But we move on now to our final story of the evening back in Scotland, and regulations to improve Scotland's parole system, providing greater transparency for victims, relatives and the public, have been introduced to Parliament. The proposed changes include creating a specific procedure for victims who are registered with the Victim Notification Scheme to observe parole hearings, establishing new arrangements for the Parole Board to publish redacted and anonymised summaries of their decisions to release prisoners, explaining the reasons for doing so. A summary will also be provided to the victim or family members involved, should they wish to receive it, and making clear that the Parole Board for Scotland may take the safety and security of victims and family members of victims into account when deciding whether or not to grant parole. So Emma, obviously this is something you'll have been looking at today. What do you make of these proposed reforms?
Well, we've had some high-profile cases that have been brought to chamber in questions or debates, and my colleagues on Justice Committee are obviously going to be looking at this, and I would support the proposals and the changes so that we make sure that victims of crime, victims of violent crime, get whatever further protections that they may need. As we are looking at supporting people who come out of prison in order to get them supported in a pathway that is more positive as well. So, but my goal would be obviously to make sure that however we take this forward, that the people that have been on the receiving end, the people that have been victims, are the ones that are supported, and obviously the wider family as well.
Mm. And Roger, what about you? Are these the kind of reforms that you think are necessary in the parole system?
Yes, I think society has moved on a lot since parole was first introduced a long time ago, and I think there's a demand for more openness, more transparency, so that the victims of crime in particular feel that they're receiving justice and are able to see that they're receiving justice and that there's care for them in the system, as well as people who are leaving prison, for example. So I think from what I have seen of the proposals, I think I would broadly support them.
Well, that's a good way to end then. Thank you very much to Roger Mullin and to Emma Harper for joining us tonight. Always a pleasure to talk to both of you. And thank you to you at home for joining us as well. There would be no point at all in making the shows if not for you. So thank you very much for spending part of your Tuesday evening with us. If you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland, we would ask that you please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up there as a supporter. Your £5 a month is what helps us keep the lights on and keep bringing these shows to you. We are, of course, also running a crowdfunder just now. We're trying to raise enough money to employ a full-time editor and some full-time journalists. If you're willing to make a one-off donation, or you're only able to make a one-off donation, you can do that by going to broadcastingscotland.scot/donate. If you're not able to support us financially, you can still do us a big favour by following us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, by liking our Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube channel, finding us on the Amazon Fire Stick, and then sharing these shows around with your friends and family. Word of mouth is the only real way that we have of spreading the word about what Broadcasting Scotland does, so do please help us out that way. If you think Broadcasting Scotland is worth watching, then we're sure you can convince somebody else that it is as well. And finally, even with full-time staff, we have a lot more things we'd like to achieve here at Broadcasting Scotland, particularly with the election in sight. We want to have people at every count across the country, if at all possible, and for that we're going to need volunteers. So wherever you are in Scotland, if you're interested in helping us to build a better broadcaster for Scotland, please do get in touch with us. We'd love to have anybody, whether you have existing skills that you want to put to use or you want to learn some new skills, we are here to help. So do please get in touch with us if you are interested in that. But that is all we have time for tonight. So thank you once again to Roger Mullin and to Emma Harper. Thank you again for joining us. I'll be back again tomorrow at 7. But until then, have a great evening. Good night.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.